What is at the core of someone who might be afraid of commitment?
Usually it comes down to the fear of not being good enough. Because when we commit to somebody and we really commit into a relationship, someone is going to be with us. They're going to really see us. And what it brings up for a lot of men is, oh, they're going to see my deficiencies and then they're going to reject me. And there's all sorts of offshoots to, if there's a fear of commitment, maybe they are afraid of, like you said, the conflict, or they're afraid of rejection. But ultimately, what I see again and again is this fear that like they're not good enough. And if I get into a committed relationship, the woman I'm with will see that I'm not good enough, and that will confirm the fear that I have about myself. But the thing is, often I see they don't realize that they're even feeling this. They just notice the stories, they just notice the thoughts that are happening, and then they start joining the dots to all the relationships they've had, or joining the dots to all the times that their partner has been disapproving in some way, because deep down what they're feeling in that moment is they're being disapproved on, that they're not good enough, that they've done something wrong, and that they're bad in some way. And it's the confirmation, even that tiny comment, that tiny reaction from their partner is confirmation of this deeply held belief about themselves, which they want to run away from and they want to avoid.
Welcome to the Heart of Man podcast, a podcast for any man seeking to live in alignment with his deepest core and lead a life of profound meaning and connection. I'm your host, Alex Lehman, and I'm here to empower you through transformative conversations, eye-opening insights, and practical wisdom. Join me now as we venture into the heart of man. Let's dive in.
David Chambers is a dating, relationship, and intimacy coach who spent the last decade guiding men into creating the love, sex, and connection they long for by helping them cultivate authenticity, emotional intelligence, and self-leadership. His work today invites men to drop the masks of performance and step into a truer way of relating, one where intimacy, attraction, and deep connection can naturally emerge from who they really are. But David didn't come to this work through theory. This path was shaped by his own lived experiences. After years of painful relationships, years of chasing validation through meaningless sex, and a deep fear of commitment, he found himself disconnected from the very love and joy he longed for. The breaking point came during a world trip after another painful breakup in Bolivia. What could have been just another collapse instead became a defining turning point. David committed to a journey of self-discovery, healing, and growth that reshaped his entire understanding of masculinity, intimacy, and what it truly means to love well. Through this path, he shed the weight of stereotypes and societal expectations he learned of what a real man should be. He discovered that sharing his feelings doesn't have to be a sign of weakness, but an act of courage, that authentic vulnerability creates deeper connection, and that our imperfection makes us human and relatable. It was this commitment towards transformation that now fuels his work with men, guiding them to create authentic attraction, build deep emotional connections, embody healthy masculinity, and experience connected sexual intimacy. In our conversation, David and I dive into what lies at the root of the fear of intimacy that many avoidant men experience, how our earliest imprints of love shape the way we show up in relationships, and how men who struggle with commitment can learn to feel safe again when their first experiences didn't convey a sense of safety. We explore the importance of learning to be with our own emotional experience and to build the capacity to be with the emotions of our partner, and the difference between sex and true intimacy. We also explore how behind much of many men's sexual promiscuity, there can be a hidden longing for nurturance, gentleness, and physical touch, and how embracing and bringing that desire into a relationship can profoundly change how a man connects not only with women, but also with himself. I found this to be a deeply raw and wide-ranging dialogue, and I'm grateful for David's honesty and lived experience in demonstrating how we can challenge our old narratives and imprints of love, relationships, and what it means to be a man in order to create connections that feel safe, authentic, and alive.
All right, David Chambers. This has been a conversation a long time coming. I've been looking forward to this one. Welcome to the Heart of Man.
Thank you for having me, Alex, man. It's been a pleasure.
I want to begin by naming that diving into your work in preparation for this conversation, I had observed this through line. And in my own words, the way I would put it is that it seems like you've gone through this arduous journey of confrontation and challenging and re-educating essentially societal stories that you might have been indoctrinated into, but also certain ways of being that were conditioned into you. This could be in the realms of how to be as a man, emotions, sex, dating, relationships, commitment. And it seems like there eventually came a breaking point where you had come to recognize how all of this was harming you. And this is essentially where I would love for us to go in this conversation. And particularly for those men who are in relationship or who desire to be in committed partnership. And to bring it back to my first question to you, you've spoken openly to your own challenges around commitment and as well the avoidance that came with that. So, to offer our listeners a bit of an understanding about you, I would love to hear what is your backstory on all of that, and as well what had led you to this journey of exploration and essentially now sharing this with the world.
Yeah. So I guess my backstory, like many of us, it's attached to kind of childhood wounding or trauma, depending what school of thought you come from. And I guess I grew up, on the edges of London, young black boy in the 90s is where, my time. And I guess my father was somewhat distant. My parents weren't together by the time I have memory, I always say. I remember seeing him and spent time with him here and there, but emotionally, he's a very distant man. And I'd say this is like a generational thing. Like my granddad, his father is exactly the same. And that could go as far as it could be a cultural thing amongst black communities, and especially amongst Jamaican men. I can speak of quite honestly, like this lack of emotionality. Like even, Western European men, there's a bit more of it there, but in Jamaican men, particularly towards their children, there's a particular attitude towards children that I've seen in my family, I've seen it in other families around me. And I saw how when I got to probably the age of my kind of 20s, that there was this very black and white thinking that I had about the world. Things were right or wrong. And it could lead to people really wanting to listen to me and wanting to follow what I said and what I wanted to do, because I created clarity, but it also made me very judgmental as well, right? Which caused a lot of issues inside of relationship. So a little bit more, like I saw my dad. My dad has 5 children with 4 different women. He has never been married. And as far as I know, he's never really lived with any of his children for a long period of time, right? So he's a commitment phobe, and it's obvious, right? I remember from a very young age, my dad telling me, people that get married become boring, right? He told me this one day. We were driving, and so there's this like whole cultural, this upbringing of like commitment is bad. And then when I was 14, my mum got married when I was about 9-10 years old, got divorced in a very difficult and very acrimonious divorce when I was kind of in my mid-teens, between like 14 and 16. It really dragged on for a number of years with a man who we lived with, who I didn't get along with, and it was very clear after a little while that he had no interest in being involved in fathering me at all. He kind of gave the illusion of this to start with and then didn't. So my story around commitment is, commitment leads to hurt and pain, because I saw my mum go through incredible hurt and pain and stress. At one point, she was off work for 2 years with stress. The doctor signed her off for a whole year in one stroke. Was like, you shouldn't be working. You've got too much going on in your life. Like, you need to just rest and recuperate. And so I attached commitment to being bad from what I saw, right? And then all I saw in my childhood was broken relationships breaking down, people being hurt, and children being the kind of, should I say, cannon fodder of those relationships breaking down, being neglected and so forth. So this story for me developed of like, commitment is bad, right? And then I guess I add on there that I got into a relationship, first love, 16, a girl who broke my heart. And then once she broke my heart, we broke up and it broke my heart. And I was probably about 17 years old at that time. So I think by the time I was 17, I was like, okay, relationships lead to pain and hurt for everybody involved. So I went into university, and, like many men that many people go to university, I spent a lot of time having lots of sex, enjoying myself and partying and getting drunk. And then I guess into my 20s, I was really longing for a relationship, but also I felt trapped inside relationship, right? And there's this constant kind of like wanting relationship, feeling trapped. And then there's also a part of me that loved having sex and was very curious about sex and intimacy and, spending time with women who were very open sexually, or we created relationships that were very open sexually, where we would discuss what we enjoyed, we would try new things and all these sorts of things. So there was this part of me that loved this deep intimacy and connection, but also loved freedom and independence. And this all kind of culminated in through years through my 20s and getting into another relationship in the back end of my 20s, which was a very, a really loving relationship. But I was always in this constant strife of wanting to be free and shutting down and not expressing myself and not expressing my needs, assuming that I wouldn't be listened to, assuming that, she wouldn't meet my needs or give me what I needed. And our relationship broke down in Bolivia when I was about 32, I think I was. And I remember vowing that day, I was like, I'm not letting this happen again. I'm going to do something about this relationship stuff. I'm not going to let this happen again, because it's another relationship that's broke down with a perfectly great woman. And I need to stop doing this. And I guess at that point, there's a lot of men that might have gone in the direction of relationships don't work and I'm never getting in one again. Right. But that was more me kind of 5-6 years before. I guess I had real agency. I believed I could change this. And I guess that was really the kind of like culmination moment you mentioned in making a shift in my life and how I kind of related, not just to women and relationships, but also to my inner world as well, because I saw there was a problem there with how I was dealing with how I felt, my needs and so forth.
I wonder what made you recognize at that stage that you have that agency, because I think that is a really powerful step to take. And I as well see that this can be such a challenge for so many men, that they might feel consumed by the challenges that arise. And they have this push and pull dynamic where one aspect of them wants to be in the relationship and wants the intimacy and closeness, but then their nervous system imprint might be relationship is not safe, relationship is bad, love is only going to hurt you, whatever story might be there. And this is beyond just our cognitive understanding, like this is deeply embedded within our nervous system. So to bring it back, what led you to understand I have agency over this, and how what was your path as well around really starting to find solidity within the realms of relationship?
Yeah. So I think my agency is a lot to do with like just my life belief that like having power and control in my life. And actually you can map it back to a single book, right? When I was 21 years old, a friend of mine, she gave me a book called Conversations with God. And I read this. I hadn't read a book at 21 years old. I hadn't read a whole book since I was about 13 years old, right? And I read this book in one weekend. And
Wow.
I remember just reading this book and being like, shit, I can create my life how I want to create my life, not just in the way that my parents live or what they did. I can create a new path for myself. And I think I took that into my kind of years as a 20-year-old, and I kept reinforcing this with my own experiences and the things that I was doing, that I can chart and create my life as I want. Relationships were one of those places where I didn't have as much confidence, right? If I'm really honest, in my 20s. I felt kind of like there was these patterns I just kept living out, and I would often blame the women I was with as an easy way. But I guess this moment when I was, 32 years old in Bolivia, I'd been traveling for almost a year around the world, traveled through, India and Southeast Asia and come to Bolivia. And I was just determined. I was just like, I want this to change. I want something different. I want a different experience of this. And I guess I knew I was really good at connecting with women. That was something
Yeah.
that I'd become skilled with. I could meet women, I could date, I could have fun, I could be open, I could be honest. But the second that it became kind of commitment, something shifted for me, right? And I guess the journey after that was, first of all, there was a long period of like, okay, do I want a committed relationship? Do I want a committed monogamous relationship? Is that actually going to work for me? And there was definitely some beliefs that couldn't be possible for me, right? And I lived inside of that for quite a while of not possible. And then I went into, I don't want a committed relationship. I want an open relationship. I could be polyamorous. I can love more than one person at once. And I explored that for a couple of years, for a few years. For a few years, I was only open relating. Even when I met my now partner, also the first year of our relationship, it was an open relationship. And I always credit, there's a lot of talk about open relationships even in this moment, and there's a lot of resistance around them. Often there's assumptions that the woman's being manipulated, or it's not what she really wants, and so forth. Or the man is just running riot with his toxic masculinity. He doesn't want commitment. And it's interesting to me because, like, when I met Ulsa, I was really committed to her, like ultra committed within a few months. But there was in me, and still really lives in me to some degree, a desire to be with other women, right? So what that gave me though inside the relationship with Ulsa was I had to face a lot of the difficulty I had with the many of the aspects that meant that my monogamous relationship in the past failed. I had to deal with conflict head on, right? I had no excuse, right? I had to deal with conflict head on. I had to have really difficult conversations very often. You know, hey, I've slept with somebody else, or I'm going to go on a date, or something like that. Like, that's a difficult conversation to have with someone that you love. Um, you know, she didn't always, at those moments, she didn't always take it very well. Should we say, on the, like, externally, emotionally, it would be like tears and upset and confusion, and it would trigger wounding and so forth. So I'd have to sit with this. You know, I kind of recount this story of once telling her that I slept with somebody else, and she sat in front of me crying for probably 10 minutes. And I just sat, I looked her in the eye very deeply, and I just breathed with her as she cried, and feeling all this, all like the feelings of me being like doing something wrong, failing, hurting her too much, and I should leave. Like, all these emotions that arise when we hurt somebody, and particularly I see with avoidant men when they hurt a woman. This feeling of like, oh, there's something wrong with me. I've done something wrong. I'm bad. All of these had to come up and be felt while I stay grounded and present with her and what's going on with her experience. So it doesn't just become about me falling into my own experience and be like, oh, we should end this. You know, this isn't good for you. And just staying with the experience. And what that taught me was how to communicate honestly, like how to express what I needed, express my feelings while listening to her as well. So I credit being in an open relationship as actually giving me the foundations of what I needed, what I was unable to do in my past relationships, and bring that into our relationship. As well as, you know, I spent a lot of time studying tantra and all sorts. Like, bringing love was always something difficult for me. So my 3 years studying tantra like really opened up my heart and allowed me to like tap in and feel that love. So I'd say that there was this kind of 3 year period, probably 18 months before I met Orsa, and maybe the first kind of 18 months of our relationship, that gave me the tools to be in relationship. Like, it gave me the tools. And I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff, but like those vital tools that I never saw modeled for me in my childhood and the people around me, because I just assumed if there's conflict, okay, there's conflict, we don't talk about it, like we just push it away, or the relationship ends. That was the model I had. So I had to kind of shift that. And in, you know, sitting in front of my partner upset and her, repairing, learning the art of repair as in our side of a relationship, gave me a lot of the tools I needed to have a kind of happy and harmonious relationship.
This is incredible, David. And, you know, I'm so happy as well that you're giving such specific examples, right? Because these are, I imagine, experiences that listeners, that men can very much relate to, and are the very things that are stopping them from really going into that next level in the relationship, because they don't want to rock the boat, or they want to
Mm,
ensure to keep the peace. And so maybe it starts with little white lies, or withholding of their experience. Maybe it doesn't even have to be a lie, or they're contorting the things that they would like to say, the things that would actually be more truthful and more authentic, because they know if they were to say it in the way that, you know, it actually feels truthful to them, it might bring up a trigger. It might bring up a certain level of irritation. I notice I want to reverse a little bit, and I want to slow down the conversation. And I notice I want to bring the conversation back to, what do you believe are some of the bigger fears that men who are listening, or men who might be challenged in the realms of commitment and struggle with avoidance, what are some of the fears that they have? I feel like you've been naming some already. You know, this could be the fear of conflict, or this could be the fear of being perceived as bad, hurting somebody. But I wonder, what is at the core of someone who might be afraid of commitment?
mm. Yeah. Usually it comes down to the fear of not being good enough. Because when we commit to somebody and we really commit into a relationship, someone is going to be with us. They're going to really see us, right? And what it brings up for a lot of men is like, oh, they're going to see my deficiencies and then they're going to reject me, right? And there's all sorts of like little kind of offshoots to, you know, if there's a fear of commitment, maybe they are afraid of, like you said, the conflict, or they're afraid of rejection. But ultimately, what I see again and again is this fear that they believe, it's more of a belief that like they're not good enough. And if I get into a committed relationship, the person I'm with, the woman I'm with, will see that I'm not good enough, and that will confirm the fear that I have about myself. And that can lead to kind of confirmation bias, which is like searching for evidence from our partners, right, of them indicating to us that we're not good enough. So that can be anything from getting upset about something. So say, for instance, I expressed it like, I want to go out with my boys tonight, and my partner is like, oh, okay, cool. Then it's like, oh, well, I've done something wrong, I'm not good enough, I'm bad. And that can lead, that feeling, the kind of belief, and with the feelings that come up, trigger maybe some over the top reactions, right? And inside of kind of avoidant men, when I say over the top reactions, you might be thinking of like shouting, yelling, and all this anger. And that is one strand that I see in some men. But actually, it's a more internalized over the top reaction that doesn't come out. It looks very like, okay, cool, I won't go. Yeah, that sort of thing. Okay, fine, I won't go. Because that's an over top reaction, right?
Yeah.
The very kind of secure way to deal with this is like, oh, is there something up there? Can we have a conversation about this? What's there? You know, that's calm, that's grounded, that's relational, right? Whereas the kind of more avoidant leaning person, the person who is afraid of commitment, they create disconnection because they want to go inside, they want to pull themselves away. And what's going on inside them often is like, oh, why are they doing this? Like, they always do this to me, this kind of catastrophizing and seeing things in very binary ways, and creating all these emotions, and creates disconnection from them and their partner. But the thing is, often I see with the men is they don't realize that they're even feeling this. They just notice the stories. They just notice the thoughts that are happening. And then they start joining the dots to all the relationships they've had, or joining the dots to all the times that their partner has been disapproving in some way. Because deep down, what they're feeling in that moment is they're being disapproved on, that they're not good enough, that they've done something wrong, and that they're bad in some way. And it's the confirmation, even that tiny comment, that tiny reaction from their partner, is confirmation of this deeply held belief about themselves, which they want to run away from and they want to avoid.
Yeah. So essentially for me, like what it really points to from everything that you had said is just this deep internalized experience or expression of shame that they might be holding, whether they know it or it's unbeknownst to them. And it's almost like they're doing everything that they can to ensure that aspect of them is not seen, or essentially running the show. And I think one of the things as well that I consider as well when it comes to avoidance in relationships, and to bring it to the personal, what I've at least observed in myself is when I'm initially dating someone, there can be that avoidance in me. And I notice how, unless I really feel safe with the individual, I don't actually want to offer someone the capacity to influence me, to impact me. And I notice that this is a way for me to essentially maintain control, to maintain agency, to maintain a sense of power. And I see that this can also be part of the conversation for so many men, that there's this deep longing to maintain a level of agency, because whether they can consciously speak to this or not, there is this recognition that if I really allow myself to be seen, I would essentially need to lose this perceived sense of agency or power or control that I might have.
Yeah. And this is something I see with quite a lot of men who we would say are kind of anxiously attached, but they've been hurt. They've been hurt once, twice, multiple times. So there's a protection of like, okay, I want relationship. They get into relationship and they can be, you know, personable and open-hearted, but there's always this like, I'm going to keep you at a little bit of distance, right? Because I don't want to like you too much. I don't want you to like me too much, because then you might start, like you said, use a beautiful word there, influence my life, influence my feelings enough for me to influence the decisions that I'm making. And if I start making decisions based on how I feel about you, I'm no longer in control. And I guess what I see a lot with guys is like this fear of not being in control,
Hmm.
this fear of not being in control, which is often kind of coupled with this fear of dependence. Because if you're influencing me, I become dependent on you. And I've kind of floated this with some of the groups I've run. It's like, if I lose control, I don't know what's going to happen. I can't maintain certainty. I don't know where this is going to go, and I assume I'm going to get hurt. And there's some men I've spoken to, there's this almost this unconscious fear of becoming like a child again, right? And being under the influence and dependency of a mother or parents that they're wanting to avoid.
Yeah. What do you believe is a new context that we could potentially provide listeners here who might still operate under this frame? And I wonder, how can relationship actually not be something where they fall under this like dependent role, but essentially it is something that contributes to their life?
Mm. I think a huge part of this is actually around like belief in self,
Hmm.
like belief in like you can maintain you while in connection. And what I see with a lot of the men I work with is this, like they don't really believe that they can do both of those things. It's either I'm in connection and I'm overwhelmed, or I'm dependent, or I'm kind of under the spell and control of the woman I'm with, or I'm alone.
Yeah.
This is binary, getting back into this binary thinking of seeing the world in this very like binary ways of being. So it's a kind of capacity of like, oh, you can still have your life and have the things the way you want it to be while also bringing connection in. And it's to do with like kind of compromise, but there's definitely a mindset around noticing where the thinking goes into this like binary of like, oh, if I do this, and then the mind runs off with all these like story, it projects a story anything from like 6 months into the future to 2 years to 5 years in the future of, you know, especially when the dependence is like you brokenhearted and you can't do anything about it, and you're wallowing in your own like crying, you can't do any work, you don't go to the gym, you've got fat and all these things. And it's like just noticing like, oh wait, that story I've just created there basically is, I'm assuming I become absolutely helpless, you know? And like just remembering that, oh, actually, I'm not this kind of helpless child that can't control anything. I've got agency here, and I can be with this person, and I can have my life, you know, and I can have like the freedom that I desire. And noticing that what happens a lot is that story gets run in the mind.
Hmm.
And I call it a kind of like, we grab all the feelings of that story and we dump them on ourselves now, in this moment. And we feel that, and we attribute those feelings to the relationship or the person we're dating, and think, oh yeah, this is not right for me, I need to leave because this isn't going to go anywhere good. But actually those feelings are all just because we've generated this story in our mind, and we're feeling all the emotions of that story, and we just attach it to the person now, and it creates this kind of like, oh, this isn't going to be good, this isn't going to work, I'm going to lose all this thing, instead of actually being in the present moment and being with us now and being like, oh, this feels good, I like this. And oh yeah, I did skip my gym session to go on a date with this person,
Hmm.
but like, okay, that's just one gym session. And maybe I can just move, I can do that at a later point in this week. Because I see this a lot with kind of avoidantly attached men. It's just like rigidity around their calendar and their diary, and when they do certain things, like when they gym, when they see friends, and like this uncomfortability with trying to bring someone in or compromise some of that to bring a partner in. So a lot of it is like coming into presence, like, oh yeah, look, I've projected this story. Like, oh, that actually has nothing to do with this person. Like, how can I lean in and be with the discomfort? Because I think this is something we really struggle with, is being with the real discomfort of our own emotions and
Hmm.
staying there and not trying to do something to kind of distract ourselves or eject ourselves from the situation.
Absolutely. And something I would like to as well bring in is, the work of individuals such as Harville Hendrix, who wrote books such as Getting the Love You Want, where we consider as well that a lot of the relationships, the romantic relationships that we fall into, unbeknownst to us, there is a familial imprint that essentially is running us, that is guiding us. And a lot of us don't actually know that these protective mechanisms that we have essentially are dated back to childhood, where we were essentially this helpless, powerless, vulnerable individual. And it's like we learn these protectors early on, and I'm like, what am I supposed to do to never ensure that this ever happens again? Oh, okay, I'm going to operate in this way. I'm going to become self-reliant. I'm going to become independent. I'm going to become a performer. I'm going to become a people pleaser. I'm going to become a nice guy, right? So there's all these ways that we learn to operate based on our first imprints of love. And it's like we allow those to run us without actually ever challenging those. And I think it is a moment when we actually consider, when did I first learn this? Like, when did I first start operating in this way? And is this actually my authentic way of operating? Where does this date back to? And I think it requires our capacity to actually challenge that and inquire, what would I actually do beyond just the fear of what this person might think of me, or if love might be removed from me?
Yeah, yeah. There's a wonderful book, right? Get the Love You Want. I take a lot of inspiration for that and bring a lot of that into my work. One of the things is like you said, challenging the narratives and the ideas. And there's such a simple question in coaching is like, what would you do if you weren't afraid? Like, what would you do if you weren't afraid? You know, so much of our lives can be controlled by fear, consciously and unconsciously, because fear can show up as apathy, confusion, and a whole raft of other things. But it's like we often are, when we meet fear, we use it as a sign to mean we should stop. We be like, oh, I'm feeling fear. Oh, I should stop doing that. Like, especially when it comes to our hearts, I really believe men will do things with their physical bodies, right? They will run marathons. They will jump off cliffs. You know, we will jump out of planes. But on average, if a man has to take a risk of his heart, he shits himself. He becomes scared, right? Especially the avoidant man has to take a risk of his heart. No way. That is the worst type of pain that we try and avoid, right? And this is socialized into us as men. So it's like, can we have courage? Can we tap into that thing? You know, men love the idea of courage, you know, taking action in the face of fear, you know, but can we have courage of our hearts, of our feelings, of our emotions? Can we, like you said, can we look at these narratives we've had, these stories about love, relationships, and so forth, and start to go, oh, actually, I learned that from my dad. I learned that from my family. You know, so much of the time when I'm speaking to men, I'm working with them, I ask these really cliche questions like, how does your relationship you're in now mirror the relationship your parents had? And they'll go, no, it's nothing like it. Then we sit in silence for a little bit. And then I'm like, well, I guess my dad used to do this thing that I'm doing where there's something wrong and I don't want to talk about it. Ah, really? Yeah. How did you see your mum respond? Oh, she used to keep kind of trying to push. Right. That's what your partner's doing, right? Yeah. What would your dad do? He'd either withdraw more or he'd blow up about it. Right. What did you do? Yeah, I guess I really blew up, didn't I? Yeah. And we're like, great, cool, okay. We've started to see that there's this like thread running. You can see you are reenacting, right, what you've seen, what you've absorbed, right? There might be some slight differences, and you might not be your dad, you might be your mum, depending on the relationships. But we reenact so much of what we've seen, right? Because we absorb it before our brains could have memory to start with, right? It's happening in the first couple of years. It starts to happen before we're even born. So the key is like being willing to look. And I find this is a difficult thing for men, is to look back at the past and really honestly look at it. And especially men who are new to the work, because we're often really afraid of what we're going to find. If I start to look back, what am I going to find? You know, I think we have this fear we're going to find there was some sort of sexual abuse or some serious abuse that we experienced that we've buried. And I've got friends who that actually happened to, right? I've got friends who started doing the work, and they found that there was some serious abuse happening in their lives. And good friends of mine, and I asked them, was it worth it? Was it worth going through you uncovering all this stuff and have to go through these difficult like months and years to come out the other end? And hell yes is the answer that comes from them. They are so glad that they uncovered that stuff, because it stopped running their lives, right? You know, just because life is okay and good and your relationships are okay, it doesn't mean that there's not something in the background that's just like in the shadows, unexpressed, unseen, that isn't being like a puppet master to you. You know, just holding you and moving you in places. And you think I'm talking to listeners here, you might think it's the women that you're meeting or the environment you're in, or you might think it's dating apps, you know, like you're thinking it's all these other things, but the one place you're not looking is inside of you. This little puppet master, you know, that this event or multiple events that happened. And when you can break free of those, the thing we often desire as men, freedom, is attained, not through what we create in the outside world, but freeing us from the almost, I don't want to use this term, but it's what's come to me, these like dark forces and in the shadows that are hidden, that are controlling us, that we didn't know had power over us in the slightest.
One of the things I'm considering, David, is that another fear that arises for so many men who might consider stepping into this work is the emotions that they'll need to face. And
Mm,
essentially, how what I sense with so many men is this deep need for emotional safety, and
mm,
how there's been such an incredible absence of that within their entire lives. They've either been met with criticism, judgment, being shut down. And so eventually, so many men learn mechanisms to ensure all of these emotions never come up, which, I had as well considered for myself is the space where we're actually at our most vulnerable, because we actually never learn how to navigate our emotions. We actually never learn how to be with the experience of intensity arising within our body, and actually learning to regulate ourselves and learning to be with that. I mean, I just want to draw our attention back as well to the example that you had shared about sharing with your partner that you had slept with another woman. I mean, just I'm just also just listening and considering the amount of emotion that will come up, right? The guilt, the shame. And it's like needing to face that, right? The fear of disappointing a woman, right? Like so much can arise within that process. And I wonder, what was your process like to when you recall back to that time when you had that fear of commitment, or you were still very much run by your avoidant pattern? How did you essentially become emotionally literate, and not
mm,
just literate, but essentially learned how to be with those emotions, learn to work with them, and learn to regulate them?
mm. Yeah, I think this is probably, it's like multiple strands. Like I spent a lot of time in various kind of communities. I did a lot of work for a man called William Whitecloud. I was in his world for probably like 12 to 18 months doing various workshops where there would be shadow work done in group. There would be he'd use a lot of intuitive practices, where you just speak from parts of yourself. So I guess to put it simply is finding myself in safe spaces to practice, finding myself in safe spaces to practice feeling and expressing. So those spaces could be workshops or retreats, or even just evenings. When I was going to my tantra school and learning there was a lot of space for feeling and expression, because as you said, we don't grow up with safe spaces to express, right? It's not really, you know going on Instagram and talking about how you feel as a man isn't a safe space. It's not a safe space to speak, right? Because you've got all sorts of random people that will take what you said wrongly and possibly criticize and attack you. Sometimes the relationship you may be in, is not a safe space for you to express various parts of who you are, right? Because you haven't cultivated it to be that, right? And you have another person who will have their triggers based on that. So this is why I think for me, it was spending a lot of time like in various spaces, like understanding like, what am I feeling? Oh, I can express this here. Being given a question, from a facilitator, and being sat in front of another man, and answering that question, and being like, and then receiving myself, expressing myself in a way that maybe I hadn't done in before, and learning that I can be that person. I can be a person that does that as well. I think there's also friendship. I think we can't overlook the power of friendship when it comes to emotionality and self-expression. I started to develop friendships with the men that I knew by expanding that range, and just like
Mm.
expressing more of me, or more of my struggle, or more of what was going on, and seeing if those men could meet me. And I was very lucky, like most of my friends really could meet me in that, and our friendships developed. And I made new friendships as well, outside of those friendships, outside of those, from going to, like, there was a point where I was going to pretty much any workshop that was interesting to me. Any workshop was interesting to me. I remember going to something called what was it? It's run in London. They do it in Berlin as well. Oh, I'm going to call it Sex Talks, but it's not. It's run by a psychedelic society. I can think of the woman that runs it. Her name is Jules. I've met her a couple of times. And it's basically an evening workshop where we talk about sex. talk about different aspects of sex, and we go off into a group of just men, and we go off into a group of just women, and we come back into a mixed group. And I put myself in this because I feel comfortable talking about sex and have done for a number of years, but going into that space and just being, not knowing what it is, not knowing what the sharing would be, and both feeling my own experience and sharing, but also feeling other people, was a really important part of for me, of becoming more emotionally literate. Because when you're in a space where you're listening and you're just listening to one person, and there's 20 people, for instance, in the room, all your attention is on that one person, and you empathize, you feel their experience, and you consciously and unconsciously relate that to an experience that you've had. So that can be a really revealing way for us to get more in contact with our feelings and emotions as well, to like become more emotionally literate. And then I would say practices like breath work. There's one breath work in particular I remember doing, was in Hackney in London, where I probably cried for about 20 minutes during that breath work session, run by a wonderful woman, Hannah Goodman. And it was a men's session run by a woman, which I think had a really special dynamic. And what came up for me was this grief from the relationship that I mentioned earlier that broke down when I was in Bolivia. All this grief from that I'd never really felt, right? And it's these sorts of experience that guide you to feeling in the spaces that are curated and safe and so forth, that enabled me to feel more of my kind of emotional body, my emotional experience, past and present, and then take that confidence. It's like an emotional confidence, like, oh, I can handle these emotions, I can handle these feelings, this capacity increase, and then take that into my life, right? And continually kind of having that practice, as well as like men's groups, men's retreats, all those things, like as practice grounds for emotional expression, and then bring that into my relationship, and then bringing the kind of capacity work of being with the storm of my partner, her upset and so forth. So it was just this years, and I wouldn't even say I finished. I'm still doing it. I'm still looking at ways in which I can sharpen, and ways I can expand my emotional range and capacity and presence. But it's this kind of cyclical piece of learning in safe spaces, or creating safe spaces where you can express, and then being able to take that into your life, and also take it into places that aren't safe. Yeah, because I think that's a key part of emotional expression and emotional capacity, is you can't always wait for the moment to be safe for you to express what needs to be expressed, because then we can get into this cycle of, oh, I'm only going to speak when it's safe. And then that's what I used to do way back. It means I didn't speak at all, because I could always look for signs of danger. Whereas if I can still express myself in moments where it's not quite safe, I don't believe it to be safe, I believe my thoughts, and I believe I can deal with the reaction. I can deal with the
That's it.
reaction. I have confidence I can deal with the reaction that might come.
Yeah. Yeah. Essentially, we're sourcing a sense of safety now within ourselves. And I would argue that is the place from which we will most safe, regardless of what the circumstance might present itself. So, a lot of what you said, I would love to just bookmark this conversation on sex, and would love to dive more deeply into it. And I just want to return to one thing that you had said, and as well, just share a few of my own personal pieces that might add just as well to the experience for any listeners. So, just in terms of everything that you had said and sharing as well, or referring it back to the dialogue that we had around the fear of men losing themselves in relationship. What I would argue, getting into such spaces, I love the word that you use, which is practice ground, getting to the place of the training ground, the practice ground. I would say this is the place where we actually get to know ourselves, right?
Mm,
So many of us as men, we have actually never directed our attention towards our internal world, right? There's been so much fixation, focus towards the eternal world, accumulation, seeking what I can gain, performance, all of that, which can be great. But I think there is an entire world that we have dismissed and missed out on. And I think it can actually leave us feeling vulnerable, and more vulnerable when we actually don't take that step into that direction. And the more we actually are in spaces where we feel perhaps a bit of discomfort, right? Where we're being confronted with questions that we have never been asked, where there's a container and there's a certain structure that is added, and where we're essentially held within the feelings, or at least there is a permission field for those feelings. We actually source safety to actually begin to feel them. And from
mm,
there, this is actually where we begin to make discoveries in terms of getting to know ourselves. And I don't know if you know much about my own personal background, David, but my passion has always been embodiment.
Mm.
Starting with the realms of meditation, that's what I would say was my first kind of realm into this path, and then stepping into the yogic path, and then finding breathwork for myself. And I would say breathwork has been the foundational element that has deeply changed my own life, particularly in the realms of conscious connected breathing, where I'm now a facilitator. And I would argue that is such a critical place where we can actually begin this journey of getting to know ourselves on a deeper level. And there's something to say, for me at least, about that ability to close my eyes and to be with my internal experience, while I know there's facilitators who are supporting me, who are assisting me, where I don't necessarily have to be at the edge of the intimacy of being exposed to the individual. That gives me, or gave me at least, an initial sense of safety. And very similar to yourself as well, I 3 years ago, after a relationship breakup, I had this clear conviction with myself that I never want to be here again, and I'm going to ensure to really find a level of proficiency and expertise in the realms of relationships and sexuality, which had brought me down this deep exploration into tantra, and as well yogic intimacy and sexual polarity. And I would say this was really an added edge for me to not just go through these experiences and have the practice ground be with myself, but rather have it be in relationship with other
Mm.
individuals. And I would argue that is the place from which we can actually gain a level of safety. If we've been hurt
Mm.
in relationship, it is the very place of relationship where we're actually going to gain a sense of safety again.
Yes, yes, definitely. It's this, and I'm starting to see this with like group work. Is I think often we think, men think of group work and they want to gravitate towards like one-to-one work with a coach or a therapist, something like that. And what I'm seeing inside of group work is that the power of being seen, right? You get this when you're you're in polarity, in practice and so forth. You're in front of somebody and you're having to practice in front of someone, and you're being received and held by that person, while also being received and held by the group who are also practicing, and also any of the facilitators there. So it's like these multiple layers of kind of safety and permission and
Mhm.
being seen, which really allow us to reveal in a safe space. And I think these spaces are deeply transformational. Deeply transformational. And I mean, like, group work can be anything from, like you said, it can be polarity practice, it can be a men's embodiment retreat, or it can just simply be a men's circle where we're sitting in a circle listening and talking. It's like any of these spaces can be really transformational for us to feel this internal safety of being us and revealing little bits of ourselves again and again and again, and being met by group.
In a moment, I would love to pivot towards this conversation of sex and intimacy. But before we pivot, I wonder if there's anything else that you would like to add in the realms of creating a sense of safety in relationship, in closeness, when that has felt threatening in the past.
Yeah. Hmm. I think, I had to take a deep dive into I interviewed David Sutcliffe yesterday for my podcast,
Mm.
and I was watching his interviews with Andrew Tate. And what really struck me, and this might seem it's going to make sense in a moment, is Andrew Tate's capacity for rationalization, thinking and doing. Yeah. Like, he's a very powerful man, incredible mindset, incredible output. But he does what a lot of men do, is he spends so much time in his mind, so much time rationalizing everything, that he misses out on presence and real connection, right? And I think this is something that a lot of men have to kind of come to terms with, is that you spent so much time, as you kind of mentioned earlier, like trying to create in the outside world, that actually you've allowed your mind to be so filled with stuff, doings, what needs to be done, what needs to be remembered, what needs to be rationalized, that you're losing out on one of the most important ingredients for connection, which is presence, which is this kind of pure beingness with somebody else, right? Of being in the moment. You know, like he talks about with like polarity practice, you get to be in the moment with someone and allow the space to inspire the next thing, the next action, the next word, the next sound. And I think this is something that, to be really in connection with people, to cultivate deeper connections, more meaningful connections, better dating lives, better sex lives, a cultivation of presence, of being with someone and allowing the thoughts and the doings to kind of drop. And if we have been highly successful men who are very solutions and thought orientated, this can actually take quite a while. I was there, you know, I've done 3 10-day Vipassanas, which has helped me massively. But this cultivation of being present, to being really just there, allowing yourself to allow any thinking to subside, to feel the ground beneath you, to look someone deep in the eye and just to be with them and be with them without there anything to do or anything to say or anything to comment on, is a really powerful thing to cultivate.
Beautiful. And what I might want to add as well is that I see that the most powerful distinction that I would like to offer in the realms of presence is embodied presence, right?
Mm,
Because there can be this association of presence to just being in the now and being here, which of course is amazing, right? And being in this mindless space, which is amazing. But I think, especially in the realms of intimacy and relationship, I would argue that that closeness is really something that we actually experience with and through the body. And so
mm,
having that depth of connection within our own body, which is essentially, our transmitter, or what shows us where the other person is at, if we can increase or dial up our sensitivity and our attunement. And I think this is really where we can amplify the closeness and the connection.
yeah, 100%.
I would love to pivot the conversation now to these themes of sex and intimacy. And
Mm,
where I would love for us to begin, David, is to somewhat entangle those associations and terms, because it seems like a lot of individuals, and this was as well the case for me, that we associate sex and intimacy as one and the same thing. And I wonder, what is the defining differences that you're seeing between the two?
mm. Yeah, I see intimacy as closeness.
Mm.
So that intimacy can be with, as you kind of described earlier or just now, a kind of closeness to ourselves, having intimacy to my own feelings. How close am I with my own feelings? How intimate am I with my own body and its sensations? How even intimate am I with my own desires, whether those are sexual desires or non-sexual desires? I see intimacy as this kind of closeness. So I see it as like a bigger pool of things, and sexual intimacy being one of those things. In that sexual intimacy is like how deeply close can I be with someone in a sexual moment. And I guess I see sex as this activity that we do, this thing that we do with one another, that can feel really mechanical and feel really cold, and can be quite clinical and quite transactional if we lack the intimacy, if we lack the closeness and the feeling. And actually, it can actually be quite dangerous
Mm.
if we are two people and we are lacking intimacy and closeness and attunement, which you mentioned just now. This lack of attunement for ourselves and what we want. This is something, I was speaking to a group of women. I did a talk for a group of women recently, and one of the women described how she chronically through her life not really being attuned to her own feelings sexually, and found herself in a lot of sexual situations that she didn't really want to be in, because she hadn't really noticed that she didn't really want to be there, because her focus was on gaining attention and being liked in those moments, instead of being with, oh, do I want this? Does this feel good to me? How am I feeling in this moment? So that's one place. Or one of the other places we find ourselves is we're so consumed by what we want, our own desires, right? That we are not attuned, we're not intimate with the actual other person and what's going on for them, their cues and so forth. So sex on its own can be really beautiful, can be a lot of fun, right? But I feel to have these deeper experiences of sex, the intimacy part becomes a really vital kind of cog in there. And obviously we can have intimacy-less sex, you know, banging, fucking could be great, could be interesting, can be educational. But for me, what I've come to learn from my own experience of my life is that this intimacy piece is really important, for the depth of experience. And that intimacy can be something you can generate in half an hour and 20 minutes, whatever. It doesn't have to be something that takes months and years, but it can also be something that takes months and years to create. But this closeness, the intimacy, closeness with our feelings, closeness and attunement to the other person, for me I think this is where as men we struggle. That's the thing we really struggle with.
Yeah. And something that I'm also seeing in my past experiences and also with many men is there can be this deep yearning for intimacy. We might not know it. And there's this deep longing for nurturance, closeness, care, love, but we're using the vehicle of sex to actually get those things. And I'm not
Mm.
saying that we can't receive those things through the act of sex, but I've seen as well in my own life when I don't or didn't have a capacity to actually create moments of intimacy that didn't require the act of sex, I think that created a lot of tension and a lot of difficulties in a relationship where it almost felt like for partners, or what I would hear as well from clients' experiences, where it's almost like the women felt somewhat used or even objectified in their experience, in order to actually have the men feel loved. So within that, I wonder, how can men who might not yet have the understanding of how to create that intimacy beyond just the sexual act, how can they start creating that so they're not so reliant on that? That also doesn't create tension within the sexual realms.
Mm. And really say not so reliant on that, as that's obviously with a partner, like trying to use sex as what I call like a Trojan horse for intimacy. You know, on the front of this little horse, it says sex on it, and it's like, oh great, everyone's like, oh, we have sex, but actually what the man deeply desires, what's inside, is this desire for intimacy.
Mm.
But also usually entangled in that is a fear of intimacy as well, right?
Mm.
So what I think is, coming back to the emotional piece again, is like acknowledging maybe that you actually might be afraid of what intimacy would lead to. You know, if I'm close to somebody, you know, if I really open my heart, what do you fear was going to happen? What do you expect that's going to happen? You know, start with some questions with ourselves to get more intimate with our feeling and our own fears and worries. What's our belief about the meaning about us as a man if I want this closeness? You know, what do I fear other men would say to me or tease me about if I said, actually, I really want to just feel held by a woman. I want to feel really close to her. You know, I want to feel that love, that feminine energy, that loving feminine energy, that I really long for that. What do we fear other men might say to us or think about us? Because I think we start to realize that we've all been indoctrinated with like, I think men will think I'm a pussy, that they'll think I'm weird, that, you know, all these things start to come up. And then we start to learn like, oh, actually, I might really deeply desire this, but really be afraid of this at the same time. And like, just bring some compassion as well, right? You know, I think compassion is an incredible healing tool. To be honest, it's like, bring some compassion to those parts of yourself that's like, oh, I'm longing for this, but I'm also afraid of this as well. So we're starting to come into contact with those parts in ourselves. I think is an important piece. And if you're in relationship, that can be a really powerful conversation to have with a partner. It can be really daunting. Don't be wrong, it can feel scary, but to bring this to a partner and be like, hey, I've started to uncover that actually I would love to feel more close to you. I'd like to feel more hugs, more kisses and so forth, but I don't know how to do it. I don't know. You know, and I know for a lot of us men, to say we don't know is almost to feel like we are not good enough men, right? You know, the kind of old man box rules tell us that as men, we should always know what to do or how to be. But just to bring the, like, I don't know, but I'm open to learning. Yeah, I'm open to learning and I'm afraid. I'm scared, I'm nervous, whatever. Like, bring that to your partner and create solution together, because it's a really vulnerable piece to bring, but it will really lead to some deeper connection by just revealing this part of you to your partner.
One of the things I'm just reminded by that, I might just want to add here, David, which is I was speaking with a therapist called Dewey Freeman, and he was pointing back to the book of Richard Rees, which was Of Boys and Men. And I
Mm,
believe within the book, I haven't read the book yet, but I believe in the book he had cited how many boys already at the age of 3 are receiving significant less touch, which is one expression of the way we receive nurturance. Is already present at a very, very young age. So, what it communicates or suggests for me is just this incredible deprivation that so many boys and later on men actually have within the realms of nurturance. And so, I just as well want to normalize this deep need that we all have for nurturance, and having that also just be okay, that we deeply desire this.
yeah, yeah. As I've read the book of Boys and Men, fantastic read.
Yeah.
And the conditioning that we receive as boys is that we don't need those things. They're not as important for boys, right? The touch, the holding, the words of certain types of the emotional check-ins. I was talking to some mums recently about this, where the mum noticed. She said, "Oh, I realized that when my little girl falls over or fell over, sorry, that was their firstborn, we'd be like, oh, are you okay? How are you feeling? Do you need anything?" And when our son later came along and fell over, and he would look at us, we'd be like, "Oh, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with you." And in that, we're already telling a boy, your emotional experience doesn't matter. Just override it. It's fine.
Yeah.
Just suppress it. Just in those little sentences there.
Hmm.
We're already telling that young boy not to have empathy for his feelings. Yeah, we're telling him, don't worry about your feelings. They're not important. And then
Hmm.
that little boy grows up and he doesn't learn empathy because he hasn't learned it for himself and his own experience. And then he doesn't have empathy for others. So it's really important that we realize as men, we have a deep desire for touch, right? As much as the women in our lives, right? We just don't know how to engage it because we have grown up with so much, first of all, fear amongst other men. Man to man, the only place we can really touch each other as men is in sporting contexts, right? We're allowed to. If I'm playing football and we win or we score, I can hug the man who scored, the other teammates. We can hug, we can hold each other. If we just win the cup, we can cry together and all those things. But the day that finishes, the next day, it's a handshake, it's a slap on the back, it's a high five. That's as far as we go. We can't have a 5-second hug. We don't do 5-second hugs with each other, right? So we just got to notice that as men, there's a deep desire for this, right? And then there's also this fear of being seen as homosexual that men experience around touch with one another, right? So that leads us to only seeing touch as something we can get from a woman, from the feminine. And then we have attached that as sexual touch is the only way we can really have, because if I'm walking along the street holding hands with a woman and we're 13 years old, what happens? Your boys make fun of you, they say you're whipped, you're all these sorts of things, right? So we internalize all this, and then what do we hear from the older boys and the other boys and the other men that we know? They talk about sex, they talk about fucking, they talk about the things that they do with, or more honestly, to women. That's how we talk about sex, right? She did this to me, I did this to her. We don't talk about how it felt. We don't talk about how beautiful the touch of her skin was and the beautiful smell or how silky her hair was. No, we talk about the doings. So we already learn that, like, all this intimacy stuff, this more subtle feelings, these subtle experiences of closeness, we shouldn't be interested in those. We're not going to be looked up to for those. Whereas girls are talking from a young age about these intricate details and the feelings and so forth. Us boys are just not doing that. So we kind of grow up with the longing to be touched, but without the experience and the tools, and even believing it's important for us. So there's always this kind of like, internal conflict that I desire this, but this is all that's there. And we don't even notice there's a conflict. So it's like getting close to the feelings that we have. And also, I think, and a really important aspect for a lot of men is like, I'm going to actually, one thing before I say that is the way that we masturbate really dictates the way we have sex. I've come
Hmm.
to realize this for my own personal self and with the men that I work with, is slowing down and spending some time with ourselves, and not just allowing it to be something we rush and try and get to the end of as quickly as possible. Ideally removing porn as something we use, not because I don't really believe in demonizing porn as something necessarily bad, but so that we become intimately connected to our own inner experience and sensations and feelings and arousal, so that we can be more present when we're in sex with a partner to that as well. And then taking that into sex, so like slowing down, whatever we're doing, because a lot of the time the reason why we're rushing is anxiety. There's anxiety involved in the sex we're having, not necessarily to do anything to do with our partner, but our own fear and worry of like not getting it right, not being good enough, comparing ourselves to maybe their past partners and so forth. So slowing down and connecting and feeling to the kind of somatic experience, the feelings that we're having, connecting to our partner and the touch of their skin, really has a more powerful way to kind of feel the intimacy, right? Because you're being more in the moment with the moment, instead of rushing from goal to goal to goal to the next point or the thing I need to do.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And some of the what I might just want to add as well is that my foundational work is essentially within the understandings of the nervous system. And while we essentially want to have a certain upregulated, um, aroused state when we're engaging in the realms of sex, we do still want to be in a more predominant, relaxed state, because that essentially allows us to stay in a state where we are able to actually feel our bodies. Because if there's too much adrenaline packed into the system, essentially it numbs the body, right? And so with that, we actually lose feeling. And so this is one of the ways that we actually sustain a level of connection. And, if I might just add as well, just one comment to the touch, because, I just want to as well emphasize how much touch has really impacted my own life, as well in the realms of body work. And,
Mm.
Essentially being in experiences where emotions would arise, where things would bubble to the surface, where I would actually be in the past all on my own, and I had to tend to that emotion on my own. I think that is usually where the greatest pain is, that we experience these overwhelming situations and we're on our own, and we don't have anyone that can actually support us or tend to those experiences with us. And so to actually have those things bubble to the surface and actually have someone there who can really support us through the process, I think this is essentially where a depth of healing can arise. And as a result, um, creates more safety to be in the body, so we can actually engage sexually in a more relational way.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. I think the body work and just learning to be with, like anywhere we feel discomfort, is learning to be with that discomfort and be present, and can we be relational if that's something we can be with. It's like that's where for me healing occurs, because like you said, it's usually something that was like too much for us to deal with and we were alone dealing with it, that leads to the wounding, that leads to the trauma.
We're going to be slowly starting to wrap the conversation up in the next 10 to 15 minutes, David. But before we do, I would like to just hear from you. Do you think there is any other assumptions or any distortions in the realms of sex and intimacy that you would just like to speak into for our listeners?
mm. I think some of the distortions we have around men and sex, I think, can be quite dangerous. I think there's a narrative that men are kind of predators, right? And there's a good reason why there's that narrative, right? There's a good
Sure.
reason, because there are men out there doing those things. But I think that harms how we relate to men as a society. And I think it also harms men. And I've seen it where very sensitive men who want to be, kind and loving and all sorts towards women, they've heard so much of the narrative, they've heard so much of the news, so much of the stories, that they kind of disengage from sex, or they become very passive sexually, or even in kind of dating, they become very passive because they become so terrified of like being accused or something, or causing unintentional harm, that they kind of withdraw. They don't take any action, they don't approach anybody, they don't try and talk to anybody. They're on dating apps and they're very passive. And I speak to a lot of women about this, meeting men who won't initiate anything, initiate dates, go on dates. They won't initiate any touch, go, they're on more dates, they're not really initiating kind of moving things forward. And it's, you know, part of this fear, I think, for men, it's not all of it, but it's definitely some strand of it, is this like, I don't want to be one of those guys. I don't
Yes.
want to be seen as one of those guys who is a predator, who does bad things and so forth. And I think we need to create more balance to also see that like there's too many of those guys. And I don't discount that, but they're still in the minority. You know, they're still really in the minority, right? And there's a lot of really kind, lovely guys out there who need more assistance in being more assertive or stepping more into that kind of healthy masculine energy that moves them forward, that helps them penetrate the world. And I just seeing more and more that the narrative of men being predators and being bad, and how that's affected like younger boys as well, because I go into schools and do some work in schools. And I think we're seeing the tide turn a little bit on this, but societal narratives take a really long time to shift. And I think it's a big distortion of men, and it's like just very blanket. It's very much like men are trash, men are predators, men are bad. And the and I think there's a good piece in there that causes us men to ask ourselves, am I one of these men? Or not necessarily am I one of these men, because that's very kind of permanent. When have I been like that?
Mm.
How do I operate sometimes like that? When there's the instances when I've done things like that? And I think that creates a good reflection. But a lot of men just get defensive and they're just like, nope, I'm not one of those guys, and don't want to look inwards. But I think we don't necessarily think about the power of a sustained narrative being projected at men and how that affects their psyche. You
Mm.
know, how does that affect, if we keep hearing the same narrative about men again and again and again as this blanket statement about men, how does that affect men's psyche unconsciously? Do we absorb that into ourselves and just go, well, if that's what you think I am, that's what I'm going to be, right? There's going to be a segment of men that are like that. Or there's going to be a segment of men, which I think we're also seeing, who are like, well, that's what men do, and I'm going to reject everything that's anything like that. Where I think we see a lot of kind of rejection of masculinity in men. And I think that rejection of masculinity isn't necessarily helpful at all. And I also think that because of these narratives, someone like Andrew Tate will gained a huge amount of power, because we've ignored the struggles of men. And someone like him has come along and articulated things very well and been very charismatic and bombastic and created a lot of noise to gravitate people towards him, and, you know, even pretend that he's really trying to help anybody. And I think that we have to really look at this and I think it's starting to happen in our countries more and more, but we have to start acknowledging the struggles of men and not just like looking at it as like it's men's problems. Men did this and it's their problem, because that's kind of a bit reductive, and seeing that men are this really intersectional group that have unique issues and problems, and that the system that we live in the world doesn't necessarily support our greatest and highest good, and take that in, and instead of just like all men are bad. Because I also think there's actually very damaging to women as well, this narrative, because there's a lot of women that I've coached who just took on this narrative not because of their own experiences, just because they heard all the women around them saying this and they believed this to be true, and it distorted how they interacted with men, until they started to do some work and go, actually, the men I meet are really lovely and they're not like those men, but I've been projecting onto all the men I've been meeting that they were all bad and they were all predators.
So much into what you said, and I just want to say I very much agree with that statement, and I'm happy as well that you left it at such a powerful note. And what I might just want to add is just the damage of fragmenting ourselves essentially from certain aspects of ourselves that are very much innate to us, right? And of course, there is such nuance that's required within this conversation. But I think what it really comes down to is learning to wield these aspects of ourselves, learning to wield our assertive nature, learning to wield our desire, learning to wield our aggression and our anger. And I would argue, when we develop a certain competence with that and actually feel safe enough to allow that intensity to actually rise within our internal landscape, I would say we can actually bring it in a way that is generative and actually not destructive to other individuals.
Yeah, totally. When we have that capacity, because, you know, just in the realm of, say, sexuality, some people desire to bring through this kind of like dark lover energy, right? This dark lover energy, and it's really vital, right? It can be a really beautiful thing if we can run that with love and connection and emotional attunement. But if
Yeah.
we suppress that in ourselves and we're like, oh, I can never be that way, right? That's bad, that's wrong. It's going to come out somewhere. It's going to come out in some ways unconsciously. And I think that's what actually creates the biggest harm to society.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, David, there's so much that we could continue to expand on. I feel like we could go on, but just to as well preserve the time and as well the agreement that we had made around our time, I would just want to slowly start winding the conversation down. First of all, I just want to say thank you for coming on, and this has been such an incredible conversation. And I think there's been new terrains that we had explored here that I haven't explored in this podcast yet. So I'm excited as well for everyone who's listening to receive value from this conversation. Before I ask you my final question, David, I would just like to ask, where can our listeners find you? And is there anything else they would like our listeners to know about?
Yeah, you can find me using Instagram as the place where I'm most active, at the authentic man _ and then the kind of the second place I'm most kind of active is on my own podcast, which is the Authentic Man podcast with David Chambers.
Absolutely. And I just want to as well name that I've definitely as well listened to The Authentic Man quite regularly, actually, even before I started with Heart of Man. And I just want to acknowledge you as well for, bringing that platform out into life. And it's absolutely valuable. So, I can very much attest to that. And I would recommend as well any listener here to check it out.
Thank you, Alex.
Cool, brother. Well, final question that I would like to ask you here, David, is one of the things that I'm considering at the core for me is that relationships are an initiation, right? Stepping into commitment is an initiation. Stepping into marriage could be an initiation. Stepping into fatherhood could be an initiation. And I think it is that call to initiation that I perceive, and it's just my personal opinion, that I perceive so many men wanting to maybe avoid or prolong, because maybe there is this deep primal instinctual knowing that an aspect of them has to die, or an old chapter of them is ending and a new aspect of them or a new chapter is birthed from that. And I'm curious, as an individual who has had fear of commitment and fear of intimacy in the past, and who's now in a deeply committed partnership but also has a son in the world, I would like to hear from you. What would you tell our listeners you've gained from that process? And as well, who have you become?
Mm. Mm. I have gained, as you said, like old chapters close and new chapters begin. It's like there's new archetypes you enter into that you weren't before, Like I've had a son, so this father energy that might have showed up with my clients and might have showed up with friends and so forth has like come online in a different way. And maybe that energy of playboy, of young man who has probably, had to die a little bit. There's that part of me that's like gone. And the thing is as you said with initiation, I see initiations as big emotional experiences, right? And the initiations are almost there to burn our connection, or burn a substantial amount of our connection to these old parts of us that need to die. Like university in many ways is a initiation into another level. If you go away, especially into another level of independence, and you have to let go of the coat strings of mummy a little bit. So I think that commitment has really, committed relationship has taken me into kind of this energy of depth and focus, right? And fatherhood has brought me into kind of this like feeling of fatherly energy and legacy and an expanded level of compassion and kind of wanting to tend to another being, and also unconditional love.
Beautiful. Let's close it off here, David. I would say let's give our listeners something to chew on here. Thanks again for this answer, and it's absolutely been wonderful to have this conversation with you. For our listeners, I hope you got a lot of value out of this conversation. As always, if you found value in it, my dear encouragement is to pay it forward to another man. And until next time, signing off.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Your time and attention is truly appreciated. If you enjoyed the show, Make sure to subscribe to stay tuned for my upcoming episodes. And in case you know somebody who would find this episode helpful, I encourage you to pay it forward. Finally, if you've personally been receiving value from the show, one way you're able to support this podcast is by leaving a 5-star rating and a written review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Not only does this help more people find the show, but it also supports me in bringing more incredible guests on for the future. I'm your host, Alex Lehman, and until next time, signing off.